A man sat down to a poker game with everything to lose. He stood up, a father of five. What started as the biggest gamble of Jeremiah Cole's life became the moment that would define it, when winning meant inheriting not gold or land, but five orphaned children whose guardian had just bet their future on the turn of a card. What price would a man pay to win everything, only to discover he'd already lost what mattered most? The saloon breathed with the rhythm of desperate men, each exhale a prayer, each inhale a gamble against tomorrow's emptiness. Kerosene lamps flickered like dying stars against smoke-stained walls, casting shadows that danced with the weight of unspoken regrets. At the center table, where fortunes died, slow deaths, and dreams were bartered like livestock, two men sat locked in a game that had stretched through three sunsets and into this fourth dawn. Jeremiah Cole's weathered hands moved with the precision of a man who had made peace with uncertainty long ago. His fingers, stained with decades of tobacco and marked by scars that told stories he never spoke aloud, arranged the cards with an almost religious reverence. Across from him, Edgar Whitmore sat hunched forward, his once proud shoulders curved inward, like a man carrying invisible stones. Where Jeremiah wore his losses like old leather, broken in, comfortable, expected, Edgar bore his defeats like fresh wounds, each one bleeding hope into the sawdust beneath their boots. The pot between them had grown beyond reason, beyond what any sane man would risk. Gold coins caught the lamplight like captured sunbeams, paper bills lay scattered like fallen leaves, and property deeds sat folded with the solemnity of funeral prayers. But it was the silence that held the real weight, not the absence of sound, for the saloon still hummed with distant conversations in the clink of glasses, but the profound quiet that settles between two souls when everything they are becomes currency in a game they cannot abandon. Jeremiah studied his opponent through half-closed eyes that had witnessed too many men cross the line from confident to desperate to broken. Edgar's breathing came shallow and quick, like a cornered animal's, and his left hand trembled almost imperceptibly as it rested on the table's scarred surface. There was something in the younger man's face, not just the fear of losing, but the deeper terror of what losing would mean. Jeremiah had seen that look before, in mirrors and in the eyes of men who had bet away pieces of their souls and found themselves wondering what remained. The cards in Jeremiah's hand felt heavier than they should have, weighted with possibility and consequence. A straight flush, hearts running like blood from 10 to ace. In 40 years of poker, through boom towns and bust cycles, through nights when luck flowed like whiskey, and mornings when it dried up like desert streams, he had never held anything finer. The cards seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, as if they understood the magnitude of what they represented. Edgar's jaw worked silently, grinding against words he couldn't speak and decisions he couldn't unmake. His stake, everything he owned, from his modest ranch on the outskirts of town to the horse he'd ridden in on, lay spread before them like an altar sacrifice. But Jeremiah sensed there was more. Something Edgar hadn't yet placed on the table, something that made his hands shake and his eyes dart toward the saloon doors as if expecting salvation to walk through them. "Your move, Edgar," Jeremiah said softly, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. The words hung in the air between them like smoke, visible and inescapable. Edgar's throat bobbed once, twice, as he swallowed against the dryness that came with standing at the edge of an abyss and feeling the ground crumble beneath his feet. His hand moved toward his cards, then stopped, then moved again, caught in the terrible dance of a man who knew he was about to lose everything, but couldn't find the strength to walk away. "I got something else," Edgar whispered, so quietly that Jeremiah had to lean forward to catch the words. "Something worth more than all this." His gesture encompassed the pot, the deeds, the glittering promise of wealth that seemed to mock them both. Jeremiah waited, his expression unchanged, but something in his chest tightened like a fist closing around his heart. He had learned long ago that when a desperate man spoke of things worth more than money, the conversation was about to venture into territory where maps offered no guidance and compasses spun without purpose. Edgar reached into his vest pocket with the careful movements of a man handling something sacred, or cursed. He withdrew a photograph, its edges worn soft from handling, and placed it face down on the table between them. The gesture carried the weight of ceremony, of crossing a threshold that could never be uncrossed. "5 children," Edgar said, his voice breaking on the words like waves against rocks. 5 orphans I've been caring for since their folks died in the fever last winter. They're, they're all I got left that matters, and they're the only thing I can offer that's worth what's in that pot. The photograph lay on the table like a sleeping serpent, its potential for destruction coiled and waiting. Jeremiah stared at it without reaching for it, understanding instinctively that once he looked upon those faces, the game would transform into something far more dangerous than gambling. It would become a reckoning. Edgar, Jeremiah said slowly, each word chosen with the care of a man diffusing explosives. A man don't bet children. A man don't put young souls on a poker table like they're cattle to be traded. But Edgar's eyes had taken on the wild shine of a man who had moved beyond rational thought into the realm where desperation made its own logic. They need someone who can provide for them, someone with means. I'm losing my land, Jeremiah. Come morning, I won't have a roof to put over their heads or bread to put in their mouths. At least this way, if you win, they'll have a chance. The mathematics of desperation, Jeremiah realized, followed rules that had nothing to do with wisdom and everything to do with the terrible arithmetic of love mixed with failure. Edgar wasn't betting the children. He was betting his ability to care for them, gambling their future against the slim hope that losing them might somehow save them. Jeremiah's hand moved toward the photograph, then stopped, hovering like a bird uncertain of where to land. In 40 years of playing cards, he had won and lost fortunes, had watched men build and destroy themselves across felt tables in towns whose names he could no longer remember. But he had never been asked to gamble with innocence, never been invited to make a wager where the stakes were measured in small heartbeats in childhood dreams. The lamp flame flickered, casting moving shadows across Edgar's haggard face, and Jeremiah saw in those shadows the ghosts of choices that would haunt them both, regardless of how the cards fell. Win, and he would inherit responsibility for 5 young lives he had never met. Children who would look to him for the kind of love and guidance that he had spent decades running from. Lose, and Edgar would keep his wards but lose everything else, condemning them all to the slow starvation that came with noble intentions and empty pockets. The silence stretched between them like a rope drawn taut, and Jeremiah found himself thinking of his own childhood, of the father who had taught him cards and whiskey, and the fine art of leaving before anyone could ask for promises he couldn't keep. He had learned those lessons well, perhaps too well, and now at 53 he found himself wealthy in money and property, but bankrupt in the currency that mattered most: connection, purpose, the simple weight of being needed by someone who wasn't trying to take something from him. "Show me," Jeremiah said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Edgar's hand trembled as he turned the photograph face up, revealing 5 young faces arranged on the steps of what looked like a modest farmhouse. The children ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 14, their eyes holding that peculiar mixture of wariness and hope that belonged to those who had learned early that the world was not a safe place, but who had not yet abandoned the belief that it might become one. The oldest was a boy with serious eyes and shoulders that already carried the weight of responsibility beyond his years. Beside him sat a girl with braided hair and a protective arm around a smaller child, while 2 other boys flanked the group with the careful positioning of sentries. They were clean and well cared for, their clothes mended but not patched, their faces showing the kind of attention that comes from someone who cares deeply but lacks the resources to provide abundantly. Jeremiah stared at the photograph for a long moment, memorizing each face as if he were already certain of the outcome. These children had lost their parents to disease and found themselves in the care of a man who loved them enough to gamble everything, including his right to keep them, on the hope of securing their future. It was the kind of desperate mathematics that had no good solutions, only varying degrees of heartbreak. "Their names," Edgar said softly, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the moment more real than it already was, "are Benjamin, Catherine, little Robert, Daniel, and Anna. Benjamin's the oldest. He's got a head for numbers and helps with the accounts. Catherine mothers the younger ones, something fierce. And Robert still cries for his mama some nights, but he's brave as they come. Daniel's got his father's way with horses, and Anna." Edgar's voice caught, and he paused to collect himself. "Anna draws pictures of angels and leaves them under my pillow when she thinks I need them most. Each name fell into the space between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of consequence spreading outward in directions neither man could predict. Jeremiah felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of bonds he had spent decades tightening, as if his heart were a fist finally learning to open. The cards in his hand seemed to grow heavier still, their weight no longer coming from their potential to win money, but from their power to change lives in ways that could never be undone. He looked again at the photograph, at five faces that had become real to him in the space of Edgar's naming them, and felt the familiar cold certainty that had guided him through countless games desert him entirely. "Edgar," he said, his voice carrying a gentleness that surprised them both. "Are you certain this is what you want? Once we play this hand, once the cards fall, there's no taking it back. Those children, they'll wake up tomorrow with their world changed, and they won't have had any say in the changing." Edgar's laugh came out broken and bitter, like glass ground under a boot heel. "Their world's already changed, Jeremiah. Their world changed the day their parents died and left them with nothing but each other and a man who can't even keep a roof over his own head. At least this way, there's hope in the change." The hope Edgar spoke of hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and fragile, and likely to burn away when the full light of consequence hit it. But Jeremiah could see in the younger man's eyes that hope was all he had left to offer, the last coin in a purse that had been emptied by grief and responsibility, and the grinding weight of trying to do right by children when the world offered no clear path to rightness. Jeremiah closed his eyes and saw his own future spreading out before him like a map of uncharted territory. Win this hand, and his life, carefully constructed around solitude and self-reliance, would be transformed overnight into something he had no experience navigating. Five children would look to him for guidance he had never learned to give, for stability he had spent his adult life avoiding, for the kind of love that required presence rather than presence, commitment rather than convenience. But losing would mean watching Edgar and the children disappear into the kind of poverty that ground hope into dust and left nothing but the bitter residue of dreams that had withered before they could bloom. It would mean walking away from this table with his pockets full and his conscience bearing a weight that no amount of whiskey could wash away. The photograph seemed to pulse with its own life, five young faces looking up at him from captured moments of innocence and trust. Benjamin with his serious eyes that had seen too much too soon. Catherine with her protective stance and the burden of mothering written in the set of her shoulders. Little Robert still young enough to believe in the possibility of rescue. Daniel with his father's gift for understanding the hearts of horses. Anna who drew angels and left them for a man who needed reminding that such things existed. "Call," Jeremiah said, the word emerging from somewhere deeper than his throat, somewhere in the region of his chest where decisions were made, not by calculation, but by the mysterious alchemy of conscience and circumstance. Edgar laid down his cards with the slow ceremony of a man performing his own funeral rites. Three queens looked up from the table like judges passing sentence, their painted faces serene and terrible in their beauty. It was a strong hand, the kind that won most pots and left most men satisfied with their evening's work. But Jeremiah's straight flush lay across the felt like a river of hearts, flowing from 10 to ace in perfect sequence, perfect inevitability. The cards seemed to glow in the lamplight, their red suits the color of blood and roses, and the sunset that had painted the sky while they played through the night into morning. Edgar stared at the cards for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions too complex for naming. Relief and grief, defeat and deliverance, the terrible freedom of a man who had finally lost everything and could therefore stop fighting. When he looked up at Jeremiah, his eyes held a strange kind of peace, the acceptance that comes when the last decision has been made and the future has been placed in hands other than one's own. "They're good children," Edgar said simply. "They deserve better than what I could give them." Jeremiah gathered the cards slowly, his movements automatic while his mind struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the space of a single hand, he had become responsible for five young lives, five hearts that would look to him for the kind of guidance he had never learned to provide. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a winter coat, heavy and unfamiliar, but necessary for the cold journey ahead. The saloon around them had grown quiet, Not with the expectant hush of men watching a big pot being decided, but with the deeper silence that falls when witnesses realize they have observed something that transcends gambling and enters the realm of fate. Other players had drifted away from their tables, drawn by some instinct that told them history was being written in the space between two men and a handful of cards. Jeremiah reached across the table and gently picked up the photograph, handling it with the same care Edgar had shown. The five faces looked up at him with expressions frozen in time, but somehow alive with possibility and expectation. He found himself wondering what they were doing at this moment, whether they were sleeping peacefully in their beds or lying awake sensing that the world was shifting beneath them like sand. "Where are they now?" Jeremiah asked. "At the ranch," Edgar replied. "Catherine's probably got breakfast started, making sure the little ones are washed and dressed. She's more mother to them than I ever learned to be father." The simple words painted a picture that made Jeremiah's chest tight with something he couldn't name. A teenage girl making breakfast for four younger children, taking on responsibilities that should have belonged to adults, but had fallen to her through the cruel mathematics of loss and circumstance. Benjamin helping with whatever needed helping, Daniel probably already outside talking to the horses in the way that children who understand animals learn to do. Little Robert and Anna beginning their day with the trust that someone would be there to guide them through it. "They know about tonight?" Jeremiah asked. Edgar shook his head. "I couldn't. How do you tell children that their future's being decided by cards? I told them I had business in town, that I'd be back by evening." He glanced toward the windows where dawn light was beginning to filter through the dust and smoke. "I'm already later than I promised." The image of five children waiting for a man who would return changed forever, if he returned at all, hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. They would be watching the road, listening for the sound of Edgar's horse, trusting in the fundamental reliability of the adult who had become their anchor in a world that had already proven itself capable of terrible unpredictability. Jeremiah stood slowly, his joints protesting after the long night of sitting, and began gathering his winnings with movements that felt disconnected from his will. The gold coins clinked together with a sound that had always meant victory, but now felt hollow and strange. The property deeds felt like burdens rather than prizes, and the photograph felt like the heaviest thing he had ever carried. "I'll need to see the ranch," Jeremiah said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "Need to meet them proper, not as strangers brought together by cards, but as family, I suppose." The word hung between them like something fragile and new, foreign on Jeremiah's tongue, but somehow right in ways he couldn't explain. Family. He had avoided the concept for so long that it felt like a language he had forgotten how to speak. But looking at the photograph, he sensed that learning it again might be the most important thing he had ever attempted. Edgar nodded, his face showing the first real smile Jeremiah had seen from him all night. It was a broken thing, that smile, cracked down the middle with grief and relief, but it held genuine warmth. "They'll like you," he said with the confidence of a man who knew children well enough to predict their hearts. "You got kind eyes, Jeremiah. Children can see that kind of thing better than adults." The walk from the saloon to Edgar's ranch passed in a silence that felt less empty than full of thoughts too large for words, of fears too complex for naming, of hopes too fragile to examine too closely. The morning sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, making the scrub grass look like precious metal and transforming the distant mountains into something approaching the sublime. Jeremiah rode Edgar's spare horse, a gentle mare with patient eyes who seemed to understand that her rider was a man grappling with circumstances beyond his experience. Edgar rode beside him, his posture straightening as they drew closer to home, as if proximity to the children gave him strength he couldn't find anywhere else. The ranch, when it came into view, was exactly what Jeremiah had expected. Modest but well-maintained, showing the signs of careful attention that came from love rather than abundance. A small house sat surrounded by a few outbuildings, the whole arrangement speaking of functionality over beauty, but possessing a kind of humble dignity that money couldn't buy. As they approached, figures began to appear on the porch, five shapes that resolved themselves into the faces from the photograph. Catherine stood in the center, her hair braided back and her dress covered by an apron that marked her as the keeper of domestic order. Benjamin flanked her left, his serious expression unchanged from the captured moment, while Daniel took position on her right with the easy stance of a boy comfortable in his own skin. Little Robert clung to Catherine's skirt with one hand, while Anna, the youngest, peered around Benjamin's legs with the wide eyes of a child taking measure of strangers. Edgar dismounted first, and Jeremiah watched as 5 children transform from careful wariness to pure joy at the sight of their guardian returning safely. They surrounded him with the unconscious grace of a dance they had performed countless times, each finding their place in the constellation of affection that had formed around the man who had become their anchor. "Children," Edgar said, his voice carrying a gentleness that transformed his weathered face into something approaching beautiful. "I want you to meet Jeremiah Cole. He's going to be part of our family now." The words were carefully chosen, Jeremiah realized, crafted to convey change without trauma, to introduce the concept of transformation without triggering the kind of fear that came from too many losses already endured. Edgar was preparing them gently for what was to come, laying groundwork for an acceptance that would need time to grow into understanding. Catherine stepped forward first, her movement both protective and welcoming, embodying the complex role she had assumed as guardian of her younger charges. "Mr. Cole," she said with a politeness that spoke of careful upbringing, "we're pleased to meet you." Her handshake was firm, her eyes direct, and Jeremiah found himself thinking that this girl had learned leadership through necessity and responsibility through loss. Lessons that had forged her into someone older than her years, but not bitter with the aging. There was strength in her that reminded him of good steel, flexible enough to bend without breaking, tough enough to bear weight that shouldn't have been hers to carry. Benjamin stepped up next, his serious gaze studying Jeremiah with the intensity of someone who had learned to read adults quickly and accurately. His handshake was careful, measured, the gesture of a boy who understood that first impressions mattered and who had appointed himself as protector of the family's interests. "Benjamin," or the boy said simply, offering his name like a gift and a test combined. Daniel approached with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with strangers, his smile genuine and uncomplicated. "You know horses, Mr. Cole. We got 3, and they're good ones. Papa Edgar says knowing horses is knowing character." The innocence of the question, the assumption that any adult worth knowing would naturally understand the creatures that had become such an important part of their world, hit Jeremiah with unexpected force. This boy had been shaped by loss but not broken by it, had learned to find joy in simple things and to trust in the possibility of friendship. Little Robert hung back, his thumb finding its way toward his mouth before Catherine's gentle touch reminded him of his manners. His eyes were wide and uncertain, holding the wariness of someone who had learned that adults could disappear without warning, leaving behind only empty spaces and unanswered questions. Anna, the youngest, solved the problem of introduction by walking directly up to Jeremiah and taking his hand in both of hers. Her touch was light but confident, the gesture of someone who had not yet learned to doubt her ability to read hearts and find goodness in unexpected places. "You have sad eyes," she said with the brutal honesty of childhood, "but they're getting happier. Do you like angels?" "I draw them sometimes." The simplicity of her observation, the matter-of-fact way she diagnosed and dismissed his sadness, left Jeremiah speechless for a moment. This child had looked at him and seen not the successful gambler or the wealthy property owner, but simply a man carrying grief who might be ready to set it down. "I think I'd like to see your angels," Jeremiah said, his voice rougher than he intended. "I think I'd like that very much." Edgar watched the introductions with the expression of a man witnessing his fondest hopes being exceeded, his face showing relief mixed with something deeper. The recognition that his desperate gamble might have been guided by wisdom he hadn't known he possessed. These children, his children, were responding to Jeremiah with the openness that came from hearts that had learned to recognize authenticity despite their young years. The morning sun climbed higher as they stood in the yard, painting everything in light that seemed to hold promise rather than simply illumination. Jeremiah found himself surrounded by 5 young souls who had emerged from the photograph into 3-dimensional reality, each one more complex and compelling than any image could have captured. "Why don't we go inside?" Catherine suggested with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to managing groups and making everyone feel included. "I've got breakfast keeping warm, and there's fresh coffee." The house interior revealed itself as a study in careful management and loving attention to detail. Everything was clean and mended, organized with the efficiency that came from limited resources being stretched to cover maximum need. Children's drawings decorated the walls. Anna's angels mixed with Daniel's horses, and Robert's attempts at writing his letters. Books sat on shelves that had been built from rough lumber, but carefully sanded smooth, their spines showing the wear that came from repeated reading rather than neglect. At the kitchen table, over eggs and biscuits that spoke of Catherine's competence with simple ingredients, the reality of the situation began to settle over them all, like morning mist finding its level. Edgar explained, in terms carefully chosen for young ears, that circumstances were changing, that Jeremiah would be helping to take care of them, that sometimes families grew in unexpected ways. The children listened with the careful attention of those who had learned that adult conversations often contained information vital to their future security. Benjamin asked practical questions about where they would live and whether they would need to change schools. Catherine inquired about household arrangements with the efficiency of someone who understood that domestic stability was the foundation of everything else. Daniel wanted to know if Jeremiah rode horses well enough to teach him advanced techniques, while Robert simply stayed close to Catherine's side, his thumb occasionally creeping toward his mouth when the conversation became too complex for his understanding. Anna, meanwhile, studied Jeremiah with the intense focus of an artist planning a portrait, occasionally nodding as if confirming details only she could see. "Will Papa Edgar stay too?" Anna asked finally, cutting through the careful diplomatic language to the heart of what mattered most to her. The question hung in the air like smoke, visible and impossible to ignore. Edgar and Jeremiah exchanged glances over the children's heads, both men understanding that this moment required honesty wrapped in kindness, truth delivered with enough gentleness to cushion its impact. "Papa Edgar will always be part of our family," Jeremiah said carefully, "but he has some traveling to do, some business to take care of. But families—" He paused, searching for words that could encompass the complex reality they were all navigating. Families aren't just about who lives in the same house. Families are about people who care for each other no matter where they are. It wasn't a complete answer, and the older children recognized that fact in the way their expressions grew more serious, more thoughtful. But it was truthful enough to build on, gentle enough to plant seeds of acceptance that could grow into understanding over time. Edgar reached across the table and took Anna's small hand in his weathered one. "Sweet girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer disguise. "Change is hard, but sometimes it's the only way for good things to happen. Mr. Jeremiah has a big house and land where you can run and play safely. He can give you things I can't, opportunities I can't provide." The sacrifice inherent in his words was visible in every line of his face. The recognition that love sometimes meant letting go, that the greatest gift he could give these children might be removing himself from their daily lives so someone with greater resources could step in. It was the mathematics of desperation transformed into the algebra of grace, complicated equations that had no clean solutions but might, with luck and wisdom, lead to outcomes that served love even when they defied logic. The rest of that first day passed in a careful dance of getting acquainted, of boundaries being tested and established, of 5 young hearts beginning the complex process of expanding their definition of family to include a stranger who had won the right to love them with a handful of playing cards. Jeremiah found himself drawn into conversations about school lessons and horse training, about favorite foods and bedtime stories, about the 1,000 small details that comprised the daily existence of children. Catherine showed him the household accounts she had been maintaining, her careful records revealing both her competence and the precarious nature of their financial situation. Benjamin demonstrated his mathematical abilities by helping calculate feed requirements for the horses, while Daniel proved his claims about understanding animals by introducing Jeremiah to each horse with the formality of presenting old friends. Little Robert warmed to him gradually, the way ice melts in spring sunshine, slowly at first, then with gathering speed as trust overcame wariness. By afternoon, the boy was showing Jeremiah his collection of smooth stones, each one apparently chosen for qualities that made perfect sense to 6-year-old logic, but remained mysterious to adult understanding. Anna, meanwhile, presented him with a drawing she had made during the morning's conversation, an angel with kind eyes and outstretched hands, welcoming a group of small figures toward what looked like a house with windows full of golden light. The image was crude in the way of children's art, but profound in its emotional accuracy, capturing something about hope and protection and the possibility of home that more sophisticated pictures could never have conveyed. As evening approached and the time came for Edgar's departure, the emotional weight of the day settled over them all like a blanket that was both comforting and heavy. The children gathered on the porch to say their goodbyes, each handling the moment according to their age and understanding, but all of them showing the kind of courage that comes from having survived loss before and knowing they could survive it again. Edgar knelt to embrace each child individually, his words to them private and soft, carrying the weight of promises and blessings and the kind of love that doesn't diminish with distance. When he reached Anna, the youngest wrapped her arms around his neck with the fierce intensity of someone who understood that some goodbyes were different from others, that some partings carried finality that couldn't be softened with promises of future meetings. "Be good for Mr. Jeremiah," Edgar whispered into her hair. "Help him learn how to be part of a family." The simplicity of the instruction, the recognition that care and teaching could flow in both directions, struck Jeremiah as profound in its wisdom. These children, who had lost so much, were being asked not just to accept care, but to provide it, not just to be loved, but to teach loving. Edgar stood and turned to Jeremiah, extending his hand with the formality of sealing an agreement that went far beyond legal documents or financial transactions. "They're good children," he said simply. "They'll teach you things you didn't know you needed to learn." Jeremiah accepted the handshake, feeling in Edgar's grip the transfer of something more valuable than property or gold. The sacred trust of souls who had already survived too much loss, but who still believed in the possibility of love. "I'll do my best by them," he promised, the words carrying the weight of an oath sworn before witnesses, both visible and invisible. As Edgar rode away into the gathering dusk, his figure growing smaller against the vast canvas of sky and prairie, Jeremiah found himself standing on the porch with 5 children who were no longer strangers, but were not yet fully family. They were something in between, possibilities, responsibilities, chances for grace that had been dealt to him by cards and circumstance, but would be made real only through the daily choices of care and attention and love. The stars emerged one by one as full darkness settled over the ranch, each point of light a distant promise in the vastness above. Inside the house, Catherine helped the younger children prepare for bed, while Benjamin and Jeremiah checked the horses and secured the outbuildings. The routines were familiar, but the participants had changed, creating a strange sense of continuity disrupted, of normalcy that was both the same and completely different. Later, as Jeremiah sat in Edgar's chair, his chair now, listening to the sounds of a house settling into sleep, he reflected on the strange alchemy that had transformed a poker game into the foundation of a family. The cards that had seemed so important just hours before lay forgotten on the kitchen table, their work complete, their magic already spent on creating something more valuable than any pot they could have won. Through the thin walls, he could hear Anna talking softly to herself, her voice carrying the rhythm of prayers or stories, while Robert's breathing had already settled into the deep cadence of childhood sleep. Catherine and Benjamin moved quietly in their rooms, the sounds of their nighttime routines familiar and comforting even to ears that had never heard them before. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the darkness, their voices weaving patterns of wildness and freedom into the night air. Jeremiah listened to their song and thought about the strange paths that had led him to this moment. A lifetime of solitude and self-reliance culminating in the sudden acquisition of 5 young souls who would look to him for guidance he wasn't sure he possessed. But as he sat in the growing quiet, feeling the weight of responsibility settle around him like a well-fitted coat, Jeremiah found himself thinking not about what he didn't know about raising children, but about what he did know about love, its patience, its persistence, its ability to grow in the most unlikely soil and flourish despite conditions that should have withered it. The photograph Edgar had left behind sat on the mantelpiece, 5 faces smiling out at a future they couldn't have imagined when the image was captured. But beside it now sat Anna's drawing of the angel with welcoming hands, and somehow the 2 images seemed to complete each other, memory and hope, past and future. the family that had been and the family that was still becoming. Outside, the wind stirred the cottonwoods with a sound like whispered promises, and Jeremiah Cole, professional gambler and accidental father, closed his eyes and listened for the voices of 5 children, breathing safely in rooms that were becoming home. The cards had been played, the wagers settled, but the real game, the long, complex, beautiful game of becoming a family, was just beginning. In the morning, there would be breakfast to prepare and lessons to oversee, horses to tend, and futures to plan. There would be the 1,000 small challenges of learning to live as 6 people instead of one, of creating new traditions while honoring old ones, of building something that had never existed before, but somehow felt as if it had been waiting all along to be discovered. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of a house full of sleeping children, Jeremiah allowed himself to believe that the hand fate had dealt him might be the winning hand after all. Not because of the cards he held, but because of the hearts he had been trusted to protect and the love he was finally ready to learn how to give. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.